everybody, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to another freaky true crime video. So today isn't actually about crimes. Well, yeah, it is actually, that's a lie. Today we are going to be doing something a bit different on this channel, something I've never actually done before, so cut me some slack if I don't do it very well. We are going to be discussing the 3 most disturbing cases of psychiatric hospitals I could find. So I'm a bit weird, and obviously if you don't know, I'm a bit interested in mental health, just a bit. I mean, we only talk about it a tiny bit on my channel, but I was researching and stumbled across a few videos about the most disturbing psychiatric hospitals that are in history, and today I thought I would recount 3 of them for you. And before anyone jumps down my throat, I'm not making this freaky video because of the patients. I'm making it because of the hospitals themselves and basically the abusive and truly like disturbing things that went on in these places, and I'm going to tell you about them all today. The first hospital I'm going to be telling you about is Severall's Hospital. So it was built in 1913 and was made up of 300 acres of land in Colchester in Essex in England. Now the building itself is something out of a horror story, I'm not even joking. The pictures of it derelict are truly haunting, and it was actually designed by 2 men called Frank Whitmore and William Town. And at the time their kind of idea for this, and seems to be very common, like this idea that these designers for hospitals made was for them to be kind of like a community. So not only would they be a hospital, but there would be shops there, and and on this one there was a bakery and farms to provide food, and it was kind of like a little enclosed community where people went, and the scary thing is that they rarely came back. So Severall's Hospital was actually built almost like a maze, and it was said that you could get from one side of the hospital to the other without setting foot outside. I know firsthand that hospitals and psychiatric hospitals are built with corridors that kind of intersect, but the fact that it was like a maze and it kind of went like in a circle is so scary to me, because you're so enclosed inside it. I don't know, that just gives me, it's freaky. This place was actually terrifying, and it wasn't really like a hospital, it was like a place where they just shoved people that they didn't want in society anymore. They would have almost like villa-like buildings inside it, and the hospital was actually split in half and separated into male and female. This kind of community where people were segregated makes the whole thing even more disturbing, because these people were literally locked inside there against their will, and just wait until I tell you more. So the scariest fact about this was that once admitted to this hospital, at the time psychiatrists were free to test any of their treatments out on the patient. So as psychology was developing, new tests and experiments were often conducted on patients against their will. Now what makes this even more disturbing is that most of the people admitted here didn't even have a mental illness. People went there if they were illegitimate, if they had behavioural problems, if they'd had a stroke. Even women who had been abused were sent here. Prostitutes went there, even the criminally insane though. So they literally mixed all of these type of people together and just took them from society and put them here. With the psychiatrists having free range, many treatments were given in this place, and during the 1940s, 50s, lobotomies were probably one of the most popular. Now, if you don't know what a lobotomy is literally a surgical procedure where an instrument, which is really similar to an ice pick, so a long stick, is inserted into the patient's eye socket, and using a hammer is moved side to side. And this literally severs connections between the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus, which is the part of the brain which deals with relaying and receiving sensory input. This procedure was often done without anaesthetic and without even consent. Electric shock therapy was also very common in hospitals, and I know people who have had ECT. It's still used today as a treatment for depression, and it actually has a very high success rate, and it literally involves sending electricity through the brain, which causes little epileptic seizures. It was done whilst the patients were conscious, without anaesthetic, and often without consent. Phrenology was also very popular in this hospital, and if you don't know what phrenology is, it's literally a psychological theory that the shape of your head and the bumps on your brain and skull has an input into the type of personality you have. And obviously this theory isn't a case anymore. People do not believe this because it's bullshit. But during this time it was very popular, and doctors and that literally would base people's kind of status in society based on phrenology. So it was highly racist due to them thinking that there was a superior Caucasian white skull, which is again bullshit, but it's completely false, and it was just very popular in this time, and it caused a lot of treatment to take place that really did not need. The worst thing about these treatments is that patients were subjected to them and sedated and tied to their bed because of lack of staffing, and this way it just made it a lot easier for them to be controlled. There wasn't masses of information about patients' experience in this hospital, mostly because a lot of people who went there would spend decades of their life there. However, the experiences that we know of patients' treatment there was extremely brutal. There was one account I found online of a woman named Dorothy. Now, Dorothy had a mental illness, so she was mentally ill, but had a habit of biting staff and patients. So they surgically removed Dorothy's teeth. Now, how horrifying is that a woman has a mental disorder, so instead of trying to help her and treat her, they literally just removed her teeth. There was some awful things I found online, such as when a man and a woman did meet off the ward, they were kind of tested to see how they were, and they fell in love, and in order for them not to have a, and I quote, mad baby, they involuntarily gave the woman a hysterectomy. A woman used to have a tic, and because of this tic, she used to click her tongue when she was stressed or upset, and because of this, the hospital literally removed her tongue. They literally took her tongue out because of this. And all of these tiny little snippets of experiences, I can't even fathom as how terrifying that would be. Imagine being in society and potentially having to resort to maybe sex work and prostitution, or being abused, or having a stroke, and then being put inside this place and potentially being lobotomized or given electric shock therapy when there's nothing wrong with you. Or even if there is something wrong with you and you are mentally ill, imagine how terrifying it would be going into somewhere like this. So the hospital was only closed in 1990. 1990. How scary is that? It only gets worse from here. The next hospital I'm going to be telling you about is Fernald State School, which was in Massachusetts in the USA. This was a place for young, psychologically ill boys, but also just a place where boys whose parents couldn't look after them anymore, either through their own fault or maybe the boy was slightly ill-behaved, would go, and they would send their boys away to here. Yet again, not every person in here even had a mental disorder, and yet it was treated as a psychiatric hospital. Evidence that half of these boys had a normal range IQ. It was mostly for young boys with learning disabilities as opposed to maybe like depression because of the age range, etc., but most of them had a normal IQ. Originally called the Experimental School for Teaching and Training Idiotic Children, and I quote, that's literally the name of it. That's what it was called. It was founded by a man named Samuel Gridley Howe in 1848. Now, this place was huge. It had 72 buildings and spanned across 96 acres of land. In its peak, there were over 2,500 boys confined there, and it became a poster child for eugenics. If you don't know what eugenics are, they were like a set of people, almost like a cult, of who had a set of practices and beliefs about genetically modifying the human race to make it better. And they literally believed that places like this would make it better. There weren't many accounts of what happened here, and many of the boys were very young, but it was said to be a highly abusive and toxic place. The boys' dorms were oversaturated. There was widespread squalor and multiple reports of physical and sexual abuse going on there. And now here's where it gets really disturbing. So this place became renowned for a certain event that took place there. So they had this thing called a science club there, and if you were going to take part in this science club, certain benefits to this science club which made boys want to sign up. So they would be given more food at meal times, they would hold parties and be taken to baseball games. So a lot of the boys signed up to go. Several of the boys' parents then received a letter home asking permission if the boys could take part in some studies where they would be given different levels of foods that are higher in nutrients and vitamins, and whether that was okay. And obviously the parents were like, yeah, that's fine, that's cool. But little did they know that these boys weren't actually being fed foods which were iron rich and, you know, given loads of vitamins. They were actually given radioactive food. These boys were actually in an experiment in which the food they ate was radioactive. It was traced with radioisotopes, and they were even injected with radioactive iron. So these boys were literally having to endure something that was potentially fatal. They and their parents had no idea that this was happening. This is just like the height of kind of abuse, is how misleading this place was that it was supposed to be a place of like reformity and mental wellness and, you know, treatment, and in fact they were just merely using these boys as guinea pigs for their own personal gain. And to make it even worse, that wasn't even the only test the boys had to endure. They were also subject to sterilization and thyroid tests. So they would constantly have blood tests. They were kept in these really locked, cramped doors. They weren't fed properly. There was sexual, physical abuse going on in this place, and this went on for years, all without their parents knowing. And the third and final hospital I'm going to tell you about is called Ospedale Psychiatrico di Volaterrae. Don't even have a go at me for how I pronounced that, because I know it wasn't right. And if you weren't disturbed enough by what I've already told you, this place was literally called the place of no return, and this place is terrifying. Like, the images of this place is actually terrifying. It was a psychiatric hospital in the city of Volaterrae in the region of Tuscany in Italy. It was founded in 1888 by a man named Dr. Luigi Scabbia. Now, Scabbia, again, had this kind of idea that we're going to create community for mentally ill people. We're just going to take them from society, we're going to put them all in one place, and it's all going to be great. So again, he built this hospital almost like a little village. It had shop, and it even had a judicial system. This place was massive, and at its peak was home to 6,000 patients, and it wasn't even closed until 1978. So when I tell you about everything that happened there, this place stayed open until 1978. Another really creepy fact about the guy who created it, Scabbia, is that when he died, he asked to be buried in the cemetery that was in the institution. So he was literally buried there, which I just find really creepy. I don't know why, it's just weird. So the building is still there, but it's derelict and it has been highly damaged by vandals, and I'm not surprised. So the living circumstances was actually awful here. 6,000 patients, and there were 20 sinks and 2 toilets to every 200 patients. The requirements were not even met for basic human needs. And again, the people admitted here, they weren't even mentally ill half the time. They went from maybe having depression or another mental disorder to literally going against the political system. If you had a different belief, you would be locked away in a psychiatric hospital. The extent of the abuse that took place here was awful. Patients were often tied to their beds with straitjackets. They were forced to take ice baths. They again were given ECT without any anesthetic. They were even put into induced comas by being injected with insulin. And after the hospital was closed, there were actually reports found of different pills and poisons that were given to patients as an experiment, with no kind of concept that a lot of the things that happened to them were irreversible. Inmates were often sedated and completely isolated from the outside world, and were not allowed any phone calls, letters, postcards, nothing, along with their belongings shoved away. And this is where it gets actually scary. So there was a case of a patient there who was there for over a decade, and he spent every day of his waking life carving into the walls. Now, when you see these carvings, they look like something from a horror film, and these weren't small either. This wasn't confined to one room. The man called Fernando Nanetti carved 180 meters of the outer walls of the hospitals. It was said that he would even work around patients, so he would refuse to stop, and there would be catatonic patients set up against the wall, and he would just carve around them. The carvings are made up of numbers, letters and symbols that no one's actually been able to translate, but it's thought to be his biography of his life and all the crimes that he's endured in the hospital and witnessed during his stay. What makes it even scarier is how he would do this relentlessly. And in his patient files, the first line, and I quote, is, "He appears well polished, talkative, yet boring." They literally describe this man as boring. He's a patient, like, why would you describe him as boring? I just don't get it. Like, what's wrong with these people? But to finish it off, I think the saddest thing I read about the case of Fernando was that he would always write letters to his family and friends, and in these letters he would even talk about how he's hopeful of leaving hospital and that he wished these people would visit, and yet no one ever visited him. So it was likely that the hospital staff would literally take these letters and just completely get rid of them as if Fernando never wrote them and he had no idea. So that's going to conclude today's video. I hope you found it interesting. I find it completely awful and it's very close to home, so I'm like, oh my god, this must have just been such an awful experience for so many people. Like, these places home to so many people for so many years. Like, people went in there and didn't get out. I read a thing where it took one signature from someone, it didn't even have to be a doctor to be confined there, but it took 8 signatures for you to get discharged, which is just, it's never gonna happen, is it? You're never gonna get discharged. It must be awful. So I do hope you find this video interesting. Like I said, I'm not doing this video because I've got anything against mental illness. Like, well, I do have a lot against mental illness. I hate it in its form, but obviously nothing against mentally ill people in general. And we're not doing this because Halloween is about, you know, scary people. We're doing this about just because it's a true crime thing. So yeah, that's why I did it. But yeah, I am gonna love you and leave you, and I will see you in tomorrow's video. See ya!